Good day, my Janeites. I'm the Austen reviewer. Today we're going to look at the 1940 version of Pride and Prejudice. This is this one here. I'll put a nicer picture of it probably up on the screen. It was made in America, released in 1940. So let's go over the plot of it real quick. This movie starts out with a very long list of who the director and everybody that worked on it was. I forgot how long they used to have those on movies. It then goes through a list of all the locations, the fictional locations of the movie, and who lives in all of them. This is where you notice that the cast has been notably shortened. We open with Mrs. Bennet and her two oldest daughters in a dress shop in Meryton picking out some fabric. They're then joined by their Aunt Phillips, and after that by Lady Lucas and Charlotte, all to gossip about the commotion of a carriage arriving in town with Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy, and Miss Darcy in it. Lady Lucas and Mrs. Bennet have a little verbal jab at each other about whose daughters are better, which is somewhat funny. I don't think they were ever really that blatant about it in the book, but it was definitely there, so I can kind of respect that. They then try to leave as gracefully as possible so that she can rush to get her other daughters, so they can rush to go home so they can get Mr. Bennet to call on Mr. Bingley before Sir William Lucas has a chance to. This is honestly one of the funniest scenes of the whole movie, is them racing home in their carriage, only to be passed by Lady Lucas and for Mrs. Bennet to demand that their driver drive fast enough to pass them too. It really is quite entertaining, though you can see a bit of where the line is, and we'll get to that when we start talking about the quality of the film itself. So they get home, and Mr. Bennet refuses to go see Mr. Darcy, and in talking to them he further reveals that he had already met Mr. Bingley a week ago when he had come to originally sign the lease on Netherfield, as well as gave him tickets for the Assembly Ball. The ball comes around. Mr. Bingley is struck by Jane's beauty and has Sir William introduce him. He then asks her to dance, and they dance and get along splendidly, and he falls in love with her. Elizabeth and Charlotte Lucas sit down in a back cubby hole so they can hide the fact that they're not dancing with anybody, only to overhear Mr. Bingley talking with Mr. Darcy, and then for Mr. Darcy to refuse to dance with Elizabeth because he doesn't think she's pretty enough, and that he doesn't want to give consequence to the middle classes. He then changes his mind and asks Sir William to introduce him to Elizabeth so he can ask her to dance. He comes over to do so. She refuses, but then immediately agrees to dance with George Wickham, who Lydia has only just that same dance sequence, or in that same ball scene, introduced her to for the first time. Mr. Darcy is of course upset by this because they did at least keep them having a relationship in this one. The next scene is when Jane is going to go over to Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet is entertaining high hopes of solitary walks in the shrubbery, which Elizabeth points out is not going to be likely because of the closing in clouds and storm that is coming. Mrs. Bennet seizes this opportunity, has Jane get out of the carriage, and changes it to a ride over so she can get wet and hopefully get sick so that she can end up staying at least a week there. Jane, of course, does get sick. The doctor is sent for. Charles knows how to interpret medical language to Jane so she understands what the doctor is saying. Elizabeth shows up, wiping mud off of her boots, though there's no further mention about that, is shown in, goes up to see her sister, ends up staying, though there's no further conversation about that happening, other than you cut to the Bennet household where it's revealed that both of the girls are over there, and they're speculating on if they can find more young men to send to Netherfield, then they can send their other 3 daughters to try to get them all married. You have pretty much all of the encounters between Elizabeth and Darcy that happen in that house happen in one scene when she comes down from being with Jane. I found this a little bit sad because they actually cut out a lot of the wit and kind of the verbal back and forth between Elizabeth and Darcy that shows them to be on an equal footing there, which I found to be a little bit sad, but I digress. We will come back to that. Mr. Bingley then tells Elizabeth that he's going to give a ball. They go home and they're very happy about it, but they have to meet Mr. Collins now. He tells Mrs. Bennet he plans to marry one of her daughters. Jane, of course, isn't available, as according to Mrs. Bennet, so he settles on Elizabeth. This all happens in the same room as them, which is kind of awkward and funny in a number of ways. We then cut to the garden party, where, of course, the youngest Bennets are making borderline fools of themselves. Charles is engrossed with Jane, and Mr. Darcy sees Elizabeth literally running away and trying to avoid Mr. Collins. He sends Mr. Collins off on a wild goose chase, and he and Elizabeth practice archery for a little bit together. Elizabeth and Caroline Bingley have a little bit of a verbal sparring match as well in this particular sequence. Then she is walking with Charlotte, and she happens to go in where Mary is singing very poorly. She's entreated to do another song by Sir William Lucas, but Elizabeth advocates with her father to stop Mary from singing. Miss Bingley then brings this as an attack on Elizabeth, who goes away to cry. Mr. Darcy finds her. They almost reconcile until Elizabeth's family comes around and does some more shameful things, and they overhear Mrs. Bennet blatantly plotting and going on about her plans for Bingley and Jane's marriage. He then walks away. She's angry at him again and goes to dance with Mr. Collins, who they don't show as actually being a bad dancer, which was an interesting choice, but we'll get to that as well. Next scene is when Mr. Collins attempts to propose to Elizabeth, which does not go as he wishes. Mrs. Bennet finds out that Lizzie refuses, goes to tell Lizzie to accept. Mr. Bennet defends her decision, as is the wonderful way that he does it. A failed proposal. Jane gets a message from Caroline, which Mrs. Bennet opens because she thinks it's a declaration from Mr. Bingley. Of course it's not. Jane is visually and terribly upset by this and runs away. Mr. Wickham comes over, proudly telling Elizabeth the story of what Mr. Darcy did to him now that he's out of the country. Then Kitty and Lydia come and steal Mr. Wickham off. Then Sir William Lucas comes over to announce that Charlotte is now engaged to Mr. Collins. She gets Elizabeth to promise to come and visit her, and that's the next scene, is her going to Hunsford. Lady Catherine comes by in the carriage with Anne to invite them over for dinner that evening. They go over. They find out that Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam have arrived just that afternoon. Mr. Darcy is still quite struck with Elizabeth. Lady Catherine tries to matchmake Darcy and Anne. Elizabeth plays the piano. They have a little bit of wit sparring again. Not that much, but a little bit. Next thing you know, Elizabeth has just returned from the walk, where she finds out what Mr. Darcy did in order to separate Jane and Mr. Bingley. Charlotte tells her that he's in the parlor or something waiting for her. She goes in. He proposes. She refuses. They use some lines, but they cut out a lot of them. They make him a little too nervous for how he was. He was actually quite confident of being accepted in the book, but as I say, we will get to that eventually. He defends some of his decisions right there to her, but then he leaves. She then immediately returns to Longbourn, where she meets Jane, who is summoned there because they just got word that Lydia has run off with Mr. Wickham. The Collins show up to talk about this. Mr. Darcy shows up, talks to Elizabeth a little bit, reveals his past with Mr. Wickham, and then leaves again. The next scene is Miss Bingley taunting Charles about how far the Bennets have fallen in the social circle in which they live in. We then cut to the Bennets packing up because the social atmosphere is so mean to them now that they're going to go live in obscurity. Mr. Collins shows up, and then Mr. Bennet gets a letter from the Gardiners, and then Lydia and Wickham show up, who are somehow rich now and can afford servants and a livery and everything. And then Lady Catherine shows up. She reveals to Elizabeth Mr. Darcy's interference. This conversation is a little bit closer to the book, but as I say, we will get to that. Lady Catherine claims that she can make Darcy penniless if he marries Elizabeth, so she has to avoid that if possible for his sake. She refuses to comply with Lady Catherine's demands. Lady Catherine then storms out, where we find out that Mr. Darcy actually sent her in, and he was waiting in the carriage. She then sends him in because she's now convinced that Elizabeth is the perfect woman for him. In he goes, finds her, they go out in the garden and they talk, and they're all both in love, and he proposes again, and then they kiss, and they see Jane and Bingley there, and Mr. and Mrs. Bennet see them from the window, and they're all excited. They go into the next room, and they see that Kitty's got a suitor as well, and Mary and another guy are performing a duet together on piano, voice, and flute. And that's the plot of the movie. So there's a few things in here. Obviously they condensed a lot. They condensed all of the encounters, more or less, between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy into that first ball they're at together. They condense all of their interactions at Netherfield into that one little encounter. They condense a lot of the other stuff, just squash it kind of together in order to make some faster. I think that does make the flow of the movie suffer a little bit. It is very one thing after another, and I can't quite entirely fault it on that one because of the time period and the amount of stuff they are actually trying to portray most things. But let's actually start getting into we'll go through the quality of the movie first before I start getting into my problems with the adaptation part of it. I took notes when I was watching the movie. I have them here. I've got a few pages, all capital sentences and many twitching and arg sounds and stuff. So our set and location is the first thing I'll start out with. This was a little bit sad because when they were actually on location, it looked quite good, and when they were exclusively in sets, you could tell that they were sets, but the sets were fairly well constructed. There were a couple moments where you did kind of see the lines, if you will. The carriage scene where Mrs. Bennet and Lady Lucas are racing home to get their husbands to call on Mr. Bingley. You can see very clearly when they're both in their carriages riding past each other versus when it just cuts to them sitting in the carriages with the landscape going by in the background. You can tell that that's obviously a green screen. That is very common with that particular time period though, so I'm not going to be quite as harsh on it as I would be with a more modern movie, but it's not going to necessarily save it either. The sets are very prettily done though. The acting quality is pretty good. They do a good job of portraying their characters and staying in characters. You don't ever believe that something they're doing is completely just off the wall or out of left field, so that's pretty decent. The plot development, this one I found a little bit spotty just because everything is presented as happening so fast that it kind of loses some of its logic. So it is kind of built up, which isn't too bad, but it's still suffers a little bit. The dialogue delivery is pretty good, and yes, I do have those separated because physical acting does play into it. Sometimes you get people that are good at physical acting, but they're not very good at the delivering of the dialogue. Sometimes that's the fault of the writers or the actors, but I just put it under dialogue delivery. So that was pretty decent. The flow of the movie was also pretty good. It was very rapid, but it didn't feel like you were getting sped up and then slowed down and then getting whiplash basically with it, so it did flow together nicely at least. Now the wardrobe is quite beautiful. They do a very lovely job with the dresses and all the hats they have and the parasols and the suits and stuff. It really is quite pretty to look at. The effects are pretty decent. They had a couple of very nice scene transitions. One of the ones that I did note as being particularly nice was where they go from where Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet are talking, and then they cut to the Meryton Assembly Ball. So that was actually decently done. That was a nice transition, so I liked that. The mood of the movie was also pretty good. They did keep it fairly consistent. And now we get into the more problematic areas. Now, I have seen this movie before. I saw it about 3 or 4 years ago. Maybe it was 5. Anyway, it's been a few years. And I guess my mind softened up on it a little bit, because when I watched it, one of the first thoughts that came into my mind was, oh, this is so much worse than I remember. And I was gonna treat it, I have a slightly different criteria for doing the setting of it, because if you have something that's been adapted for modern day, then there's certain things you can't quite do with the setting or some of the social manners and such, just because of the time period. The social rules don't fit anymore. So I was planning to give it a bit of a pass that way and assume that they had just straight up changed the setting. And I really should have looked up before I did this which years or decade they're trying to set it in. Perhaps I'll put that in maybe this corner of what it was, the fashion that they chose, what era that was. So I was going to give them a pass and try to evaluate it based on that. However, the dialogue and things they kept referencing and things they tried to make out to be social customs actually did at times agree with Regency and wouldn't make sense in the other time period. So I was going to try to give it a bit of a pass that way, because it is very blatantly not Regency, but they kept trying to make it out that it was. So unfortunately, by the movie's own insistence, I had to judge it by my Regency standards, which, as you can probably guess, it fails at somewhat miserably. The fashion that they're wearing is automatically basically completely wrong. There's certain social status things that they did that would not have been proper at that time period. The entertainments they were using were actually pretty close. The language is, I think, a little bit more modern than it should have been. The history was again problematic because they were referencing things that with a lot of people agree to be the date setting kind of Pride and Prejudice, which is never explicit, but there are certain things you can kind of elaborate out to kind of get it. They were referencing historical things that shouldn't have happened by then, and then there's other social and society things. And for instance, in the ball at Meryton, Mr. Darcy comes and asks Elizabeth to dance. She refuses to his face. She does not want to dance. She refuses to dance. Mr. Wickham walks up right in front of Darcy, asks her to dance, and she agrees. Now, Elizabeth didn't like Darcy, and she didn't want to dance with Darcy. This is kind of referencing a different scene from the book than the Meryton ball. The one they're actually referencing happened at a party that Sir William Lucas was giving. But you wouldn't have refused one person and immediately accepted another one. That would have been a huge social insult. And as much as Elizabeth didn't like Mr. Darcy, she's not going to put herself in that position. She's too smart for that. The plot is very squashed together. It's not the worst mangling of it that I've seen, but that's not the standard we're going by, so it didn't do all that well. They moved a lot of stuff. The expression of it wasn't too bad, though. The plot that they did express was done decently. They did get across most of the points. They weren't well got across, but they were gotten across. The plot wasn't particularly logical in its flow either. So you couldn't really, it didn't necessarily follow if you didn't know the story that, oh, well, this should happen next. It just seemed very one thing after another. You had no framework for Mr. Wickham before he runs off with Lydia, so that's completely out of left field. The flow also suffers by the same problems. The accuracy of the portrayal of the characters is unfortunate. Darcy and Elizabeth being the easiest examples. Elizabeth is quite witty at the start of... is fairly witty at the start of the story, but it falls off really fast. The other problem is that pretty much all of them, for the girls, are cast way too old, I think. Like, Elizabeth looks like she should be, in my opinion, in her mid-20s. She was just 20 for most of the events of the book. So it kind of... it's not very believable that way. She was mature, but she wasn't that mature. Her witty sparrings with Mr. Darcy are also greatly reduced and basically disappear completely by the end of the story, which I think is what a lot of people actually like about Elizabeth, so that is quite unfortunate. Mr. Darcy is way too charming. Like, there is... the only example of his pride are some of the lines they have him say, which are almost directly contradicted by his manner of conducting himself the next moment, and what he says to Elizabeth. But he just doesn't... he's not Mr. Darcy. How do I put this? He's a very good male lead. He's a very good male lead. However, he is not Mr. Darcy. They tell you about his pride, but they don't really show it all that much. Like, Miss Bingley seems much more prideful and vain and full of herself, which, as she should, she's actually one of the best portrayed characters as far as moving from the book to the screen in this. Mr. Bennet started out well, but then they made him almost as silly as his wife, which was kind of unfortunate. I always feel a little bad for Mary in these kind of movies, because there's very few, I think, good representations of Mary. One of the things that they did, and I wish people would stop doing this, is they make her notably bad at singing. Now, she wasn't good. Well, no. She wasn't exceptionally good at playing or singing. She lacked the taste and kind of, if you will, the ability to read the crowd. But she was still the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood. She could play better than Elizabeth, but Elizabeth's expression in the music endeared her more than Mary. So if anything, you need to very delicately have Mary be subtly better, but also very subtly worse, which is probably why they do that. It's a lot easier to just make Mary bad at singing, but think that she's good at it. But that's... actually, that makes me wonder, is there even a version that does that well? I have to look into that. Anyway, the communication of the characters are actually pretty good. Like, they do try to get themselves across. They do use some lines that are direct out of the book. They cut other sections off, though. So, for instance, in the scene in the library at Netherfield, when Jane is sick and Elizabeth is there, they have her and Miss Bingley walking around. They have the classic bit back and forth with Mr. Darcy, and, oh, you either walk together because you're in each other's confidence or because your figures appear to their best advantage in walking. Elizabeth, when Caroline asks her how they should punish him, says that, well, since you've known him so long, I'll leave the punishment to you and I'll go see Jane. Mr. Darcy then asks her why she disdains the punishment and yet inflicts one by leaving. She then says that if that is what he believes, then he is right about her not being as good at reading characters she thinks she is, and leaves. So they cut out that entire interaction, which I think is actually one of the most impressive examples of their wits being well matched before they are spending that much more time together. So it was kind of sad to see that get cut out altogether. The motives are still, for the most part, the same. Like, Mr. Wickham's motives are still the same. Elizabeth's are still fairly the same. Mr. Darcy's, even though he's not, his professed motivations are still the same. Lady Catherine's change a lot. Oh my goodness. She actively tries to get them together and approves of Mr. Darcy's choice. It's... I don't know, they were trying to redeem the character or something, but it's very inaccurate to the story. I didn't like how they made Jane's emotions so blatant, because that then completely robs the excuse that Mr. Darcy had that he believed that she didn't care for Bingley, because she very obviously does. So that was a bit of a problem there. Similarly, the dialogue was somewhat unfortunate because of those notable cuts, and they made Mr. Darcy really quite charming, and he can be charming, but they wanted more, I think, of... I haven't watched that many movies from that era. Most of the things that I have seen from then are all comedies. I do think he does somewhat more fit into the roguish, charming protagonist stereotype that they kind of had going on then, but that's more of a film study person's domain than mine, which is more the Austen books themselves. I did notice that it seemed like the dancing that they were doing would kind of phase in and out of being something that would have been Regency appropriate. So it goes from something that would have been Regency appropriate to something that would probably have been appropriate for the time period that they were portraying, even though they were saying it was Regency. So that kind of yo-yoed back and forth and was a little disconcerting for me. One of the other character issues that I kind of had, or one of the other blatant ones, was with Mr. Collins. For one thing, they made him Lady Catherine's librarian instead of a clergyman. I don't know if they just didn't want to explain how the parsonages and stuff worked, but one of his biggest kind of personality traits was that he had been brought up to be humble, but his subsequent experiences had made him proud while he still thought he was humble. So he had a very weird mix of feigned humility, if you will. It wasn't genuine. They do away with that in this one, kind of. So he's still kind of foppish, but he is still pretty proud without the... At first I thought he wasn't doing too bad, but then the more I watched it, the more it was, oh, this is sad. I used to think that you couldn't really mess up Mr. Collins because of all the other versions that I've seen. I've found him to be... You don't really like him in any of the versions, but he is at least always entertaining pretty much any time he's on screen. In this one, you could have done without him, I think, pretty easily. He keeps popping in and popping out. He's much more like a vulture, as Mrs. Bennet calls him, in this one than he has been in other versions. Lady Catherine and Anne do look like they could be related. I don't know if maybe the actresses actually were or not, but they do look like the one would have come from the other. Colonel Fitzwilliam, they have him with a curly mustache and a kilt. Now, granted, there's actually very little, if not almost no, actual description of characters in any of Jane Austen's work, so we don't know if he did or didn't have a mustache. But a kilt? You didn't wear a kilt as a colonel in the English army at that point in time, I do not think. A kilt. They put him in a kilt. And he basically says nothing the entire time, which is, again, kind of unfortunate because he is such a charming character, but maybe that made it easier to just have someone standing around without having to open their mouth. But I was sad to see it. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are mentioned but never shown. I don't know if they were expecting us to think that Elizabeth had just fallen in love with Darcy earlier, but they show pretty clearly that Elizabeth refuses Mr. Darcy, goes home basically within the next couple days, where they find out that Wickham and Lydia have run off. He shows up that same afternoon to explain to her about Wickham, then he leaves, and then she's instantly proclaiming to Jane that she's in love with him. I'm going to attribute this to the shortness of the movie, but it just seems very yo-yo and up and down and back and forth. But I think they also tried to make it oh yes, she's secretly in love with him earlier in the movie without knowing that she is kind of idea. Maybe that was more of a thing of the time period. Again, I don't know. But the one thing that always really drove me crazy, even in my memories of this movie, is how they pack up, or they're seen packing up to leave Longbourn. Because they never did that. Ever. They never planned to leave Longbourn. Their society and their connections at Meryton were having perhaps a little too much fun commiserating with them and telling gossip and going on about how they never trusted Mr. Wickham. It was never a problem of them needing to leave because of the treatment they were getting. So this is a very... I think that was the thing that probably made me rant the most, because I hadn't realized at the time. I said, oh, they just moved it to a different time period, so I don't have to worry too much about the clothes. And then that turned out to not be how that went. Elizabeth seems to be the only one that really has much of anything for personality. Mary is honestly probably the one with the second most amount of personality. Jane seems very much like an airhead that just happens to be in love with Bingley. Kitty, you basically don't get anything on. Lydia seems much more spiteful in this than she was in the book, and that's about it. It's not just her confidence and vivacity. I don't even know what to do with that one. Mrs. Bennet is pretty close. I think she's another one of those characters that it's hard to mess up on. It is quite funny, the race between her and Lady Lucas, and when she gets to the house and tells Mr. Bennet about it, he asks her, well, did she win? And Mrs. Bennet goes, no, indeed she did not. And that's the funniest part of the whole movie. Now, in the book, and in subsequent letters of Jane Austen's to her family, we do find out that eventually all the Bennet girls did get married. Kitty married... well, I'll probably get into this in another time. They do try to pair them off, though, in the movie, which I suppose is done for closure or something, but anyway. So how does this stack up with the numbers? So our set and location, I gave a 2. Acting quality also got a 2. Plot development got a 1. Dialogue delivery got a 2. Flow got a 2. I gave the wardrobe, and these are all just for the quality of the movie itself. This is independent of it being an adaptation. I gave the wardrobe a 3. The effects got a 2. The mood got a 2. So our overall movie quality out of 30 got 16. And now for the greater weight of the thing. This is how close it is to the actual book. And it's, I've got my numbers here, it's not looking so good. So of the 5 subcategories that I have for the setting, society got 1, history got 1, language got 1, wardrobe got 0, entertainment got 2. The plot wasn't necessarily that logical, I don't think. It didn't flow that well. It wasn't expressed very well, though the expression was a little better than the logic and the flow. The accuracy was also on the lower side. The characters were also not very accurate. Their communication was decent. Their motives were communicated fairly well. Their personalities were a little off, particularly with Darcy and as some of the other characters, as I mentioned already. And the dialogue was a little bit on the subpar side. So that gives us, for its adaptation points, a total of 17. Now, I don't think it aged necessarily that well as an adaptation, so it doesn't get my personal discretionary point, leaving it with a total score of 33, or once we've adjusted that to our 10-point scale, 3.3 out of 10. So it honestly was considerably worse than I remember. I thought that it was going to be more in the middle, which, in addition to it being the first one, was actually part of the reason why I had chosen this one. It honestly did worse than I thought it would do. I thought it would at least break the 4, but there were a few things that I had forgotten that didn't happen or do happen or happen very strangely in this movie that did end up losing it some points. So that is my rating for this movie, is a 3.3 out of 10. I would actually recommend seeing it, though, if you haven't. It is an interesting historical piece. It is an interesting, I think it is a valid kind of a version, but don't go into it expecting it to be your favorite version of Pride and Prejudice. But I would recommend seeing it for the sake of seeing it. It's not that bad. Like, it's kind of average as just a movie in general. It's not that good of an adaptation, but I think for its historical place and significance that it would actually be kind of interesting that way. Well, so that's my thoughts on it. Let's hear yours down below in the comments. Thank you for joining me. I remain as ever until we meet again, the Austen Reviewer. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, share it with your friends if you think they'd be interested. If you'd like to, I'd really appreciate it if you would consider supporting me on Patreon. That just allows me to focus more effort and time and resources into actually making these videos. Thanks for watching.